Hello, good evening. That was the best introduction I've ever had. Thank you. So yeah, I'm from Rotherham, sorry about that. And I'm actually very proud of it, and I'm part of the Rotherham 900 committee, which is trying its best to claim, the earliest fame of boroughhood and so on, and no one really knows what to do with it, because how do you tell people to be proud of where they're from? It's something that you don't automatically have a right to do. But as Alison's alluded to, my studies have always led me into Glasgow, because in Rotherham there isn't as much to talk about, other than that sense of division. People are often upset about these divisions, I think. But tonight I want to just talk about not Glasgow's sort of prestigious history in terms of, I'm not going to take you through 850 years of history, but I'm going to look at some of the sort of key moments in that time and the gaps. Because in terms of memory, the gaps are pretty open, and they're open to be filled by you, by historians, by artists, and I want to unpack this idea of cultural memory a wee bit, because it really has a bearing on what we think of as collective memory. So I'll show you what I mean by that, and I'll give you some examples that I think you can take away with you and apply to your sense of the past, because that's really what I think tonight should be about. So it's celebrating Glasgow, of course, and it's about having some sort of memorable experience. Certainly it's memorable for me, but I hope it is for you too. The memory is an easy subject to make connections with. Hopefully some of what I show you will resonate with your own lives. It sounds very much like I'm revealing magic tricks, but I'm not. And don't worry, when you see the text on the screen, I realise before you give any sort of presentation, you don't know what the room's like, what the setup's like. Don't try and read all the text. I'll just talk you around it, and you can have the PowerPoint slides if you want to read it like a sort of mini publication. I'll share that with you. There's going to be a video, obviously, so don't be too worried about trying to strain your eyes to read that. I'll give you the headlines of that, okay, and we'll see what happens. So that little weird image I've produced for the zero in 850 is the first ever printed in a book version of the Glasgow coat of arms from the 17th century. So it was produced in around about 1663. It was in a Bible, and then it was produced again in other publications after that. And it has all the main components of Glasgow's famous icons that you all know well. You see them on the bus stops and the street lamps. And it has the full phrase, "Let Glasgow flourish," through the preaching of the word. And that's something that obviously doesn't last through history. It doesn't exist anymore. We just know the main component of that. So if I was to do this properly, I would show you every single instance of the Glasgow coat of arms and when, and we would do a bibliography of it, and it would make a lot of sense. But I just want to show you three main ones for the sake of time. And that one of the earliest ones was actually a seal, and it's from the 14th century. And it has St Mungo, and again it has the icons of Glasgow, but the text is Latin, so we're not going to try and decipher it, especially because it's partly broken. And then you have this from 1901. Does anyone know, not from living memory of course, but does anyone know why 1901 would be a significant year in Glasgow's history?
Pre-exhibitions.
Exhibitions, exactly. So 1901, let Glasgow flourish. Nothing about preaching, nothing about words. It's very self-evident at that point that Glasgow was flourishing, that Glasgow had its own sense of identity that wasn't religious. That's a sort of undertone of this talk, I think, because when you talk about anything pre-Reformation in Glasgow, there's a connotation that we're talking about a religious identity that's changed and eroded a little bit as time goes on. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I want it to be one of these little things you keep in the background that just hums away like a fridge at night when you're trying to sleep. And you can see on the token there that it's the Glasgow exhibition. Not the first one in Glasgow, but the one I think that really turns Glasgow into this 20th century powerhouse. This image that we still carry around with us today, even those of us who know Glasgow's history is deeper and more interesting. Glasgow is a Victorian city in the minds of most people. Shipbuilding being the main component of why we're famous at all, I think. That's my book there that Alison kindly alluded to. I wanted to show you this slide, not to sort of promote myself in any way, but to show you that I wasn't really the first one to study a city through the lens of history. It's been done before at Athens, Venice, Florence. Florence being my favourite one on that list because it's a bit of a weird publication that I stumbled on in Florence, so that was always a nice thing. In Prague, the Eternal City, this myth that Prague was never destroyed during any of the wars, but retained its architectural integrity. Of course it didn't, but it's funny how myths can really survive any sort of fact. That's an element of Glasgow which fascinates me. And then this idea of cityscaping is another noise in the background that I'd like you to keep. This idea that we collectively create and recreate what a city is. Slogans, major exhibitions, sporting events, these things always help to realign what a city means to people. And if you were to picture the cityscape of Paris, it's quite easy. What's the skyline of New York like? Very easy to imagine. Glasgow's is probably the traffic cone on the top of the Duke of and the Finiston Cran. Right? Rutherglen doesn't have a skyline, so I don't even bother. All I remember personally is the Mercat Cross replica totem that's there, and it's been there since 1926. I was born in 1990, and I used to wonder what the hell is this thing, and what am I supposed to take from it? I still don't know the answer to that, but as Rutherglen gears up for 900 years of history, I wonder how are they going to make this meaningful in any way. What can we do that makes any city or town more meaningful? Cultural memory, as I define it, he says very grandiose, is the shared understanding or interpretation of any one thing built up over several generations. So it's not just my new interpretation of Glasgow, which is the final one. Your version of it in the past was fine. The version of it that my children will create is also fine. No one wins in this argument. But the key difference between cultural memory and what Maurice Halbwachs described as collective memory is that it transcends generations. Collective memory is the result or sum, a combination of individual recollections of many members of the same society, but crucially of an event that they experienced themselves. So we cannot remember 1901, that exhibition. We can't remember the opening of the City Chambers in 1888, but we can access that moment through photographs, journalism, things like that. Those things are aspects of cultural memory. Collective memory is us remembering or being at Celtic Park during a famous victory, that sort of thing. And that's the collective nature that I'm trying to offer you tonight. This is my favourite quote about memory studies in general. Memory studies is a very interesting field, and I've been trying to find a way to say anything original on that, but I always come back to this. This is about a city, of course, a very important French city, and Maurice Halbwachs says, I remember Reims because I lived there a whole year, but I also remember that Joan of Arc consecrated Charles VII there. And then he goes on to say, I certainly know that I was not a witness to the event, that I cannot go beyond these words heard or read by me, that these symbols passed down through time are all that comes to me from the past. And that's exactly what I'm trying to show you tonight about Glasgow, is that Glasgow has all these weird and wonderful features that crop up again in films about Glasgow, paintings about Glasgow. When you hear people, tourists, talking on the street about why they came to Glasgow at all, there's a sense of time being distorted when they do that, because they are conflating ideas about Glasgow and they're jumping around in time a lot, I find. In fact, when Alison alluded to the Glasgow exhibition in 2014, How Glasgow Flourished, I was doing an exit survey when people were coming out of that, and I was so excited. What did you learn about Georgian Glasgow, this great period of history that's lost? We don't talk about it enough, because the bloody Victorian period is all anyone wants to talk about. What did you learn about Georgian Glasgow? I said to them, and most of them said, oh, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, what a lad. I was like, this exhibition has not worked. People still want to talk about Mackintosh, who is great and wonderful, and I have all the stuff in my house to pretend I'm really a Glaswegian. But the truth is, the power of an image of a city cannot be changed or disrupted through factual, historical. And I found this time and again. I can't tell you that you're wrong and that this is actually what happened. Myths are incredibly hard to manoeuvre. So I just love that quote from Halbwachs because of what he says about the difference, I think, between collective memory and cultural memory. I'm sure you all know where that is. Yeah. And do you know what's going on? Oh, you don't. Sorry, I'm being far too presumptuous. That's St Mungo's Cathedral, right? It's a Victorian painting, but it's the famous painting. I say it's famous. I've seen it more than 5 times, so it must be famous. It's the defence of the cathedral by the Trades House in 1579 during the Reformation. Has anyone seen it before? I've seen a good mixture of nodding and shaking of heads, which is exactly what I hoped for. If you can see the numbers up there, is there anything that strikes you as odd about this history painting? The towers, well, yeah, because of the date, yeah. So what is it about the date you would say? Okay.
1840s.
1840, so before the painting.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And what else about, I mean, a more obvious point than that, can anyone tell me maybe how someone from the Victorian period could paint this? Does it strike anyone as, what I mean by this is, there must have been a prestige to this painter, there must have been a renown by which he could convincingly render a scene. Now, history painting, don't get me wrong, I mean, we're surrounded by them here. It doesn't mean that there was a witness to anything, that you have to be a witness to anything biblical to paint it, to depict it. But this famous event in Glasgow's past needed an image. It didn't have a pictorial representation because in 1579, no one had a video phone, to hand that they could capture this moment and then preserve it for all time. So these history paintings like this that have this disconnect between the year of the occurrence, 1579, and then the year of the painting, is one of these classic Glasgow examples where there's a rift and there's a myth that builds up around it. I mean, for example, the massive Celtic cross that's been toppled. We know that the religious reformers would maybe do that. They would demolish idols and things like this. And the Glasgow's Catholic population was pretty much run out of town. However, do we know that that Celtic cross was there? Do we know that any of it was as it seems? We have to maybe think again about how these things really are. And it's funny because I really rely on this image as an asset of cultural memory, but it's untrustworthy and it's not at all grounded in fact. It's grounded in documents and reports and town council minutes. But how do you turn that into a painting without losing the truth? Something else that happened in the cathedral and down at the cross in the year 1638 was probably better documented. It's because, and apologies for the amount of words, don't even try and start to read them, although I've been chasing down the source of that weird green man for many years, I've never found him. But this is the first ever book printed in Glasgow about a Glasgow thing was in the year 1638, and it's called The Protestation of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, and so on and so on. And it's essentially when Episcopacy was abolished and the Episcopalians were thrown out and the Presbyterians were installed in 1638. And basically it occurred to me that how do they celebrate this other than producing a book at the time, which was the sole purpose of the first ever book printed in Glasgow, was to capture a thing that had happened that was important from a religious point of view. But in 1838 they were saying to each other, why do we not make more hay of this? This thing happened in this place. We are the descendants of this idea. That's what people were saying to each other when they went to the kirk. That's what they said you should do. You should commemorate with gratitude to God that this happened in the cathedral in 1638, 200 years on. So it's an early form of commemoration in Glasgow's history, which is harking back to something that happened in a certain space. It's like consecrating ground, and I realise I'm using a lot of loaded terminologies, and of course another thing happens nearby, which is the raising of the John Knox monument. And it always occurred to me, growing up Catholic, how strange it was that you could never talk about John Knox without people in the house getting upset. And I didn't understand why until I read about him, and obviously the imagery that comes through literature and paintings and things like that. But what I found when I was studying for the book and for publication, I thought I had to be very measured about how I talk about John Knox. I should make sure that when I talk about John Knox and his statue, that I'm not making assumptions about the man or about the perceived image of the man at the time. Until I came across the account of how in 1825 when the monument was raised, people in Glasgow who were printing books about it were celebrating the fact that it's just as well Knox is there now, because he can keep an eye on St Mungo's and make sure that the Catholics stay out, essentially, and that it remains a Protestant powerhouse. And I was fascinated by this because I thought, all right, so that wee hunch that people have had for a wee while about the nature of sectarianism and the nature of religious identity in Glasgow was extremely powerful then. And it's powerful now, but back then people were raising statues and writing histories and telling one another that this is the idea that you pass down. I don't know that we're at the same place with it anymore, but the Knox monument and the proximity of it to the cathedral and that whole cathedral precinct and the way that they were commemorating things back then has had, I think, a lasting influence on Glasgow's identity. And I just wondered if that made a connection with anyone. I don't have time to go through Douglas Moore's sonnet, but it's published in 1831, and it's a beautiful sonnet about the building, the cathedral, and it basically describes how it's had 1,000 sunsets on its facade and how no religious idea can change that. So it was a nice antidote, I think, to some of the the drama that surrounded the religious aspects of it. Alistair Gray is someone who typifies Glasgow in many ways. My grandparents they lived in Ridley, and when I told them about Alistair Gray, they had no idea who he was, but they were quite pleased when I told them that he was brought up there. And of course, Alistair Gray is a bit of a household name in Glasgow. His imagery, his persona is sort of all over the city. And he said this, I'm sure that any of you who know Alistair Gray or who know Scottish literature at all will have seen that phrase before from Lanark about how Glasgow is a magnificent city, but we don't ever notice it. And that these other world cities, London, New York, Paris, the same ones I've mentioned that you can picture in your mind as having a distinct skyline, these are the same images that Alistair Gray talks about in comparison to Glasgow and Lanark. And he makes the rather patronising point that Glasgow has only ever given to the world a few bad novels and a music hall song. Now, I think Alistair Gray at that time was obviously being satirical, and he was talking about the poor state of Glasgow's sense of confidence, about how Glasgow in this time relied too much on the sort of razor gang image, the idea that working class identity is the only identity that Glasgow ought to show itself, and he was probably having a go at the sort of journalistic opportunism that went on in the shipbuilding era and No Means City and that whole vibe that we associate with Victorian Glasgow. And then his satire goes further when he talks about Hardy and Baird, because if I was to diverge this talk to you tonight about the 1820 period and look at the monuments raised to those radical weavers, you would see that he's been very satirical here, because he says Britain became an empire, everyone lived happily ever after. Of course, we know that's not the case for millions of people within Britain's empire. And he talks about the commemoration of Baird and Hardy as if it's something connected to the empire, when in fact they were going against it. And what I know from studying those two men and John Wilson of Straven is that they were treated pretty much in the same way that the Covenanters were treated, that the Catholics were treated during the Reformation. It's that sense of disloyalty. So their bodies had to be exhumed and brought from different places. It was a very strange time to have a monument raised in a city which was concerning itself only with royalty and politicians. But we'll move on from Alistair Gray to just say that if you haven't seen his work before across the city, you can see it pretty much everywhere, and especially in Hillhead or in the university area. You'll have seen this before. I came through the same zone tonight to get here. And I think that Alistair Gray maybe doesn't get enough praise a lot of times. I know that some people might think, no, that's not true. Alistair Gray is well documented and well respected. But from the 70s onwards, he's been doing a number on Glasgow in terms of making sure that the common person, the everyday person, and a sense of everyday life is documented. And that's that documentation of people, of everyday people in everyday places, that's a part of cultural memory. It's not just a statue to some Tory politician that goes up in the Victorian period that we remember. He's looking out for mostly his friends and a postman or something like that, whoever it is that happens to be on his doorstep. But it's that idea of the Glasgow people being something worth commemorating in themselves. So if you've not considered that side of Alistair Gray, I would encourage you to. Alistair Gray had an incredible sense of the depth of history of Glasgow as well, and he touches on that in a few of his novels. If you've seen this image before, you'll probably agree that it's a bit strange, because Glasgow's way up at the top on its own, and look how big Rutherglen is in comparison. Just there with the few castles that I had back then. Do you know what really annoys me just now? I'll just share this with you. Castle Street in Rutherglen doesn't even have the plaque anymore that explains that it's called that because there used to be a castle there. Right? This is the thing about plaques and commemoration, and I'm always going on about this, but if we don't have the thing that points to the history, people genuinely just walk past it and don't interact with it. Now you could say, you'd probably be right, that even if you put the plaque there, it'll be ignored. But if you don't provide the opportunity, then you've really got no chance. The thing about this, and was anyone at Louise Welsh's talk on Monday? Most people good. Louise Welsh was my first teacher at Strathclyde, and I'm very pleased to be sharing the same sort of stage crowd with her. It's incredibly nice. So she talked about the Clyde and the importance of the River Clyde in Glasgow. The Clyde made Glasgow, and Glasgow made the Clyde. There's the whole thing that goes on there. A lot of the Latin poetry that I'm going to introduce you to in a second, I promise you I won't attempt to read it, English translation only. You see that from the very first days of Glasgow's civic awareness, the River Clyde is the only thing, it seems, that the city can talk about, other than its one or two main religious centres. And this is a Latin text. It's first printed in 1586. So this poem would have appeared in about 1607, and the English translation doesn't appear until 1695. And I'm not going to read it, but I just want to point out the fact that the River Clyde is said to be Clyde, great flood for plenteous fish renowned, and that it is and that Glasgow is the Clyde's chiefest pride, and so on. So there's that connection from the earliest days of Glasgow's poetry, which says that Glasgow and the Clyde are codependent. Now, later on when we talk about St Mungo briefly, you'll see that there's a weird disconnect that happens again in time and space, because it wasn't in the River Clyde that Mungo's miracles occurred. We all know that it was another smaller body of water right up by the cathedral that these things allegedly took. I believe they did take place, but some people might not. So we have to see again that Glasgow's most famous person, St Mungo, a person that's commemorated, glorified, is being mapped at all times onto a version of Glasgow which is not of its time. It's something more modern. Obviously this is the early 17th century we're talking about, so you can't exactly call that modern, but in comparison to the history of St Mungo, it's extremely modern, and we're always doing this strange mapping of ideas onto physical spaces, which doesn't always add up, and it leads to a lot of myth and confusion, which we then peddle for the next generation. There's other poems about Glasgow that I'm not going to go on and on about tonight for the sake of time, but just to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour. The Latin text on the left, Arthur Johnston, this is from the 17th century as well, and in this book it's very interesting. It's the first time I've seen this. This is a book in which someone writes devotional poetry, and then at the end of it says, do you know what I fancy doing? I fancy writing a bunch of poems about all Scotland's cities and towns and just saying how great they are. And just, you know, if people had more time on their hands today, they might do something similar. But Ayr gets a poem, St Andrews gets a poem, Edinburgh gets a poem, Leith gets a poem, no poem for Rutherglen. But Glasgow does get a poem, and again, we're talking about how amazing the cathedral is. We're talking about the wonderful River Clyde. It's the same connection. It's that one building and it's that one body of water that seems to project Glasgow onto the world, and that's from the 17th century onwards. Glotta, has anyone heard this strange term, this strange guttural term? It makes me think of crime, I don't know why. But it's apparently the Latinised version, maybe wrongfully, but it's the Latinised version of the Gaelic clutha for Clyde, if you're wondering what that word is. And this is written by James Arbuckle, who, when this poem was published, was a pro-Hanoverian, anti-Jacobite Presbyterian, who basically said, the Jacobites better not try and come here because we're very loyal to George, and basically the River Clyde and the River Thames are synonymous at this point, so don't bother trying. That's what this poem is about. Crucially, things change. So when this poem in the middle was published again in the 19th century, all of that Jacobite context was removed, and instead people thought, let's map all this onto the wonders of the Clyde and the beautiful natural reserves around the Clyde, and they actually offered annotations in the text which you could then go and see for yourself. So it was like a tourist pamphlet. So it shows you that within a few generations, the religious and the political and the cultural issues which can sort of heat up a poem can be removed completely, and it renders the text as being something different. And I'll show you that the exact same thing happens with the Bishop's Castle in the 1888 exhibition of Glasgow. I'll show you that in a second as well. The other poem has the most imaginative poem ever. It's called Glasgow. There's loads of poems called just Glasgow, and it always upsets me that they weren't a wee bit more inventive. This isn't a great poem, but it's an important one because it's written in the standard Habbie the Burns stanza. Hail Glasgow, famed for ilka thing, that heart can wish or siller bring, lang may thy canty music ring. So it's written in that recognisable Burnsian stanza. And it was published in the late 18th century. There was like 16 stanzas. And then it was published again in 1803, and the guy had added about 40 more stanzas. Because in that period, Glasgow had become bigger, more famous, trade had flourished, the empire, overlords had realised that Glasgow was actually worth keeping, so there was so much more to say about Glasgow, and this is the poem that you find it in. And again, you find St Mungo, you find the River Clyde, you find all the main philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment in there, and they're now lost to time in some way, but I'll argue that point later on. So, the best Glasgow novel ever, probably, is The Dear Dream Place, because it's incredibly self-aware. Has anyone read The Dear Dream Place? Did you like it? Yeah. Didn't like it?
I thought the unfinished novel, he wrote much better.
He wrote better. Very good point. Very good point. And I think the manuscript recently has made its way to the University of Strathclyde, which is very curious. But it's incredibly self-aware. It's the quintessential Glasgow novel because, I mean, it's amazing to me reading it. It's as if someone's just saying, I don't know how to write a Glasgow novel, so I'll write a novel about a guy wanting to write the Glasgow novel. It's like a hall of mirrors, and it's very effective, but it's also it's so self-aware that it has to lodge itself at the heart of Glasgow's literature. Lanark we've covered to an extent. We don't have time to talk about that anymore. Shuggie Bain is the most recent Glasgow novel, Booker Prize winning. Could you ever get a more distinctly opposite Glasgow novel to James Kelman? So James Kelman won the Booker Prize in the 90s, and this chap has won the Booker Prize again for Glasgow, you might argue, but with a novel about Glasgow which actually, for me, as good as the novel is, consecrates and reiterates those same images of Glasgow that we're all already so familiar with. We're maybe in an age of nostalgia where we want to look back at some of the nicer things. We're all a wee bit shaken up, I think, and hurt by the last 20 years or so. The start to the 21st century hasn't been easy, I think, and so I found that novels often reflect this, and there's a genuine call for literature about cities and about nations to try and hark back to some other time where it's a wee bit easier on the. I know that Shuggie Bain isn't a nice novel, but it's those background images to it which are very familiar and that James Kelman would never dare to celebrate. So I find that very curious, and I wondered if that led us towards an answer about what is the predominant Glasgow space or image. Thomas Allen's photographs are some of my favourite images of Glasgow. My wife introduced me to them when she was at Glasgow School of Art, and then I basically stole the idea and I've run with it ever since. Especially because I didn't know what slow exposure was, but I now understand it in photography to mean that when the photographers back then were taking images, they couldn't exactly tell a bunch of poor Irish migrants to stand still for more than 30 seconds, so it looks like a bunch of ghosts in the room of Venice, which it is. That's exactly what it is, because these people didn't have identities. And if anything, during the Glasgow Improvement Act period, this is why this guy was here taking photographs. It was to show the city leaders that there needed to be improvements. He also took photos of the old university campus before it was moved. And so if you need a record of that, you can go on the internet and look up Thomas Allen and you'll see what the old university used to look like. But it's amazing to me that these images exist at all, because the High Street does have a strange, I don't know if I'm maybe straying into dangerous waters here, but it does have a strange energy. It's very dilapidated, nobody really likes it that much. But when you're there, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but if there's ever one place in Glasgow to get a sense of history, it's that main artery from the cross way up to St Mungo's. It's that high street, and I think that even though there's an Aldi there or whatever it is, and then all these other abandoned spaces, think of the amount of people that were living there that moved through there during the 19th century. It's quite astounding. Not long after these photos were taken, you have George Square preparing itself for the sudden and very dramatic arrival of the City Chambers in 1888. That main image, I just want to let it hang there for a wee second, that main pillar in the centre of George Square, this is going to test your memory more than it should, but do we all know who it is? Who's the main statue in George Square? Walter Scott, right? An Edinburgh man. Never mind that London boy talking to you about Glasgow. An Edinburgh man dominates Square Chief Civic Square. I find that very odd. But it's not odd, is it? Because the Victorians who built Glasgow in this age knew what would be popular, and well, to an extent, and they knew exactly how to commemorate and how to influence people's ideas of commemoration. And in a way, Glasgow, some historians say Glasgow isn't very Scottish, it's very metropolitan. And to find Scotland, you have to go to Edinburgh or somewhere else on the East Coast to find what's quintessentially Scottish, and Glasgow isn't that. I don't agree with that, but it's one of these ideas that gets thrown around in terms of Glasgow's perceived image, perceived identity, and it's that transatlantic connection that Glasgow has that also does this. So Walter Scott is there dominating this space. There's a few other statues. I believe you're getting a talk at some point about George Square, so I'm not going to trample all over that just now. But I just want to show you very quickly, as a scan, down that list, that in the 19th century, here are the people who have come to dominate George Square. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up and I was going through George Square to Strathclyde Uni, or if I was cutting through it to get Greg's or whatever, I wouldn't really stop and consider who these people were, because they all look the same, right? They're just very badly worn, seagull splattered, and they, you know, the names are there, and sometimes the descriptions are there, but generally it's not very inviting. You don't get, and this is one of my big things about commemoration. How do we commemorate? How do people interact with it? There's a story of the Alan Ramsay statue in Edinburgh, which is another Victorian product. It used to have a cuckoo clock that would come out of it. Another clock would come out, but the cuckoo would come out, and people would like, right, okay, who's Alan Ramsay then? They've got my attention. You don't really get stuff like that anymore. What you get is these boring civic squares, and maybe tourists will stop and go, oh, who's Thomas Campbell? I don't know that guy. I don't think we do that with our own civic spaces. Please disagree with me later, but I just don't think we do that enough. And when we do, we realise that these people don't represent the Glasgow that we are proud of. Now, you could, again, feel free to say, actually, no, they do. Feel free to put your hand up in this hall and say, I'm a royalist and I disagree with you, sir. But what you'll find is that here are the agents of empire, and here are the British royals sprinkled with poets and statesmen who might be publicly palatable. So it's a strange mixture of tokenism and an imperial narrative. And when the cenotaph is put there in 1924, then the stage is actually set. You know, it's complete. And so when you get certain historical moments taking place in George Square, I've thought about if I was maybe over-analysing this, but things that happen in George Square, even up until recent history, during the Black Lives Matter movement, with people defending statues because they were worried that statues were going to be pulled down in Glasgow. I don't think anyone was ever threatening to do that, but they were worried about that, and it wasn't until then, I think, that people were, oh, we better actually find out what's their history, do we need to worry about it? You know, for a long time, there was a dormant layer in Glasgow's landscape that just wasn't tapped. I think we tap it now to an extent, but I would still question why certain things are the way that they are. Going into the city chambers now, right? The banqueting hall, has anyone ever been in here? Most of us, impressive, you've all been in there. Do you all have secret meetings in there? Robert Babylonian's not allowed in there. When I was in there, they scanned me, it's very embarrassing. No, so this is kind of like the visual representation of my entire argument about why Georgian Glasgow has been neglected. Now you could say that's just a very exclusive space within a very grandiose building. How can this represent your main argument? And I'll tell you why I think it is. This mural, this triptych, was created in 1901. It was finished in 1901 by one of the Glasgow boys, I believe. I don't know the history of the Glasgow boys at all. I just know that, much like Macintosh, people tend to know who they are. And it depicts three things. It depicts legendary Glasgow, and it shows the miracles of St Mungo, as it should. You kind of are good at depicting those. And then it depicts the Glasgow Fair, which is a 12th century festival, which until really within the last couple of decades was a thing. When did it end? Does anyone know when that actually ended? The fair? Is it still ongoing?
I'm still doing a Friday.
You're still doing a Friday? See, my dad still takes us. My dad takes us on holiday in July, and it's always at the fair fortnight. And I'm always impressed that he keeps this. He retains this centuries-old tradition. The man and then what happens is you get this 12th century festival, and then why is it, I asked, that in 1901 they decided just to fast forward past the Reformation, the Scottish Enlightenment, the transatlantic slave trade era, and just decide that modern Glasgow is the new thing to commemorate. Now it could be that, you know, this is 1901, shipbuilding was arguably at its peak in terms of production at this point in Glasgow. Modern Glasgow was maybe seen then as the new dawn for Glasgow's history. We're no longer a medieval city, we're a modern city. That's maybe what they were saying, but to get from medieval to modern, you have to go through that Georgian phase and that sort of gnarly phase in Glasgow's history, which has knobbles and wrinkles and no one knows how to define them. I've always found in commemoration that if you don't know how to define something easily, you just don't bother defining it at all. That's why people like Tobias Smollett, the great novelist. He was too many things. He was a physician, he was a playwright, he was a novelist, he was a politician, and we don't know how to commemorate him because he was too many things. If you find someone in history who does something well, I won't name any contemporary people because bad words would follow, but there's people just now who are very good at conveying the same message over and over again, and they're very easily remembered, and they appear in new technologies all the time, and you can't escape them. It's the same with commemoration in history. If you find someone that you can do that with, it happens. So much like that little door that I've just deleted and put a question mark over, the main argument for my book and today's talk to an extent is that Glasgow is still missing centuries worth of its history in cultural memory and the public imagination, if you want to call it that. There's a huge period that we don't consider. And within that period, you have all the greats of the Scottish Enlightenment who actually were resident in Glasgow and produced a lot of their ideas in Glasgow. James Watt is the one exception. But James Watt is only an exception because he's useful. And that brings me into another phrase, which is University of Strathclyde's motto about being the place of useful learning. James Watt was very useful for Glasgow's memory because he was an engineer, a good Glasgow engineering boy. Not the same type of overly thoughtful philosopher who maybe only talked about moral sympathy, much like Adam Smith or someone like that. Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, so his legacy's fine. But there's a whole string of philosophers and theorists in Glasgow's history who are forgotten because they didn't do anything particularly useful or anything that fits a Glaswegian model of usefulness. And again, feel free to argue with me about that later. One person from Glasgow's history which seems permanent, and this is a good thing, I think, is obviously the patron saint. So that 1901, when Kelvin Grove Art Gallery was unveiled, as part of the exhibition of 1901, I should say, you get the depiction of St Mungo there, and then on the left, that's St Mungo again at the City of Glasgow College. And that one kind of scares me a little bit. I don't know why it is, but I like it. I do like it. I like that it scares me. But that's a newish version of St Mungo built in the Glasgow environment, and you get them on murals and things like that as well. I know that you've probably seen lots of these new versions of commemoration. And what I like about them is they're not, I could be wrong, but they're not like top-down commemorations. They're not someone building a statue and saying, you should remember this. They just appear one day and they're part of the fabric of the environment. So it's like a modern rendering of St Mungo. I think you get St Venue as well with the fish all around or somewhere else in Glasgow. So that's nice. I like that. Now, there's another section of this paper which goes quicker, so if I may go on a wee bit, I don't know what time we're at, but I want to just recap a few of the ideas before I go on, because I've been told that in lectures I tend to just overload people with ideas and I have to recap and remind them what I've said. So I'm extending that courtesy to you, and I hope it's useful. So Glasgow's cultural memory, right, I've defined that for you as being different from collective memory, because none of us were there when certain things happened. Even if you are a good historical painter, you can pretend that you were. Literature, paintings, photography, all these cultural facets are part of cultural memory. You can read history through it. Monuments are obviously the main example of that, because they are, and this is the great conceit about monuments, is that they're supposed to be permanent, they're supposed to last forever, but we know that that's not the case, that people want to tear them down, people want to build monuments adjacent to those which tell another story and things like that. And the questions are, what images are most prevalent and what histories are obscured? Now I think that the Georgian period is the most obscured image in Glasgow's 850 years, and that we ought to remember it better. And I would say probably that St Mungo has had a very good standing throughout the course of Glasgow's history, to the point where he is still favoured, and we still have the favoured image. His miracles are enshrined via the icons. I don't think it matters what the context is, those seem to be appropriate images for Glasgow, and I think that's a good thing. And we see it with street murals as well as newish monuments. But preparing for this talk, it occurred to me that when you talk about memory, you have to also be aware of what people think about time. Time is probably the main ingredient of memory, isn't it? Because you have to go away from the moment to remember it. It's a fairly standard thing to say, it's probably slightly dull, but when you consider what else happens throughout Glasgow's history and throughout Scotland's history to define what time means to people, you actually start to feel a wee bit differently about how memory works. So, as I said, the monuments are built for future generations. There's an implicit moral lesson there, like the Duke of Wellington, right? He was never in Scotland, to my knowledge, but he is one of the main Glasgow statues. And the moral lesson in putting him there at all is that we should in some way respect him, I think. Why else put a statue to someone anywhere? This person is to be revered. That's the point of a statue, to be remembered, but in that case, revered. Now, we don't necessarily agree with that these days, but there he is, he's still there. We've changed the context with traffic cone, whatever that means. But we'll talk about that in a wee minute. But we should also consider that before the Victorian period, when everyone went mad and decided to throw monuments up everywhere to everyone, before that, people's sense of time changed dramatically, I think. One of the ways in which this happened was in the Enlightenment period when James Hutton proposed his theory of the Earth, which said, I don't think the Earth is really that young, guys. I think the Earth might be very, very old. He did believe in God, and this was seen as heresy by some, that you're not allowed to challenge the Bible's interpretation of the age of the Earth, right? Millions of years or billions versus thousands. But in doing this, James Hutton maybe suggested, not for the first time in history, but for the first time in the Enlightenment period, that we can stop thinking about the age of the Earth as something measurable and start to think of it as something infinite, something that renews itself over and over again. It's quite a terrifying idea, actually. But when James Hutton proposed this during the Enlightenment period, I think that must have changed the way that intellectuals thought about time, about their perceived fame, about mortality and everything like that. In terms of Glasgow, there was the discovery of ancient canoes and the foundations of certain old buildings from about 1780 onwards. And from an archaeological perspective, I find this fascinating because they start to see Glasgow as not this thing that they've created from nothing, but as just one version of a city that they have built on top of a space which has been the thoroughfare for other civilizations before them. So obviously the idea being that the Clyde wasn't always the way it is just now. There's a strange thing with the Clyde, whereas it's seen as being immortal, right? It's seen as always being there for Glasgow. It helps Glasgow flourish because it's there. People can build a city by a river, that's what you do. But the Clyde's shape and depth and width would have been very different in the period of time when these canoes could have traversed, and therefore they end up in the foundations of buildings. So it's that sense of time being challenged in the Enlightenment period. And recently you have projects such as my colleague Steve Driscoll's at Govan, where there's the Viking artefacts and things like that, where you try and reposition the centre of the west of Scotland, not to here in Glasgow, where we typically think of as Glasgow as like, well, Edinburgh's the capital, right, but we know Glasgow as being the main city of Glasgow, and we tend to think about history as being conveyed through Glasgow. But if Steve Driscoll in archaeology, people are saying that actually if you go to Govan and you go to that part of Glasgow, that was the centre, Glasgow was nothing back then you consider the Brittonic kingdoms at Dumbarton Rock as the centre point for that. During St Mungo's time, then what was Glasgow at all? It was just like, you know, when people say it was just a glint in your parents' eye, something like that. It's something similar to the city that we now map all of our ideas about history onto as being something just not very much formed at all. So I'll now go to the exhibitions because I want to wrap up with some final ideas about how Glasgow was concluded and the imagery of Glasgow was sort of made concrete during these exhibitions. Glasgow 800, right? That was only 50 years ago. So I got an email from a colleague who said, "Oh, I remember getting the cup as a schoolboy." Does anyone dare put their hand up about this and say anything about it? Yeah.
I got one as a teacher.
You got one as a teacher? That's impressive. What was the sense? I'm sorry to use up your time during my talk just now on this, but what is your sense? Was everyone dead happy?
I loved it.
Yeah.
Everybody stole one.
Everybody's,
You get smashed them.
You
Who
get
do you
smashed.
think would just get smashed?
Yeah. I know, that's it.
That was thinking about
Waved
it.
flags at the Queen. I hate to admit it.
Excellent answer. It's just so strange, and that's why I'm so glad to be doing this talk, because it's an opportunity to kind of, as a group of people, is to rethink what is a city, why celebrate a city at all? Well, we celebrate it because we're quite proud of it, and we can channel our own memories through it, for the most part. So Glasgow 800 had this attempt to produce, I think Billy Connolly sang a song or done something. I don't know, in a public space. Obviously I wasn't there, and I've read some newspaper reports, but it's very unusual to me that that Glasgow went to these lengths for its 800th anniversary. Whatever we're doing now, we can compare it to that. Whatever Rutherglen's doing for its 900th, we can compare it to that. But the point I'm going to try and finish with is that these attempts to gather everyone together for an anniversary year, just like in 1838, they said, here, remember we kicked out the Episcopalians in 1638? It's the same thing, but on a different scale. We're trying to take stock of ourselves and our city. They did that then, we're doing that now to an extent. But in doing that, you sort of automatically start producing highlights of what's happened since then. Tonight's intent to try and work through some of those. The exhibitions, there's just some nice images of the catalogues. They were better artists back then, probably. But for the sake of the time that we have left, I'm not going to go through all of these, of course, but I'll just focus on the 1888 and the 1901 for a few minutes. I'll just focus on Glasgow, of course, because who wants to talk about Edinburgh on such an occasion as this? That's the map, the lie of the land for the exhibition space in 1888, and the image on the right is the fake Bishop's Castle that they constructed during that time. The imitation of antiquity has been successfully carried out in the construction of the Bishop's Castle, the catalogue said. And wood and paint and canvas have been so put together as quite to cheat the eye into a belief that it is a genuine old building. People were said to poke at it with umbrellas. They were so confused. We demolished this building, why is it back? Right? Now, this is fascinating to me because the Bishop's Castle and its ruin represents something in Glasgow's psyche, which by the Victorian period, it was safe to bring back. The literary mirror of this is Walter Scott's Waverley. So he wrote Waverley in 1814, 1816, and he gave the full title, it's been 60 years since. 60 years since the Jacobites almost won, right? It's since Bonnie Prince Charlie. 60 years is a generation. In terms of cultural memory, collective memory, 60 years is when it's safe to talk about them again. You couldn't have wrote Waverley in 1780 because people were still a wee bit afraid of the Jacobites when they come back and take over. So writing that novel in the early 19th century was something similar to this. In 1888, it's safe to remember the Bishop's Castle because no one's worried about Glasgow suddenly reverting to some sort of, Catholic dominion, I think, is what we're getting at. And I'll tell you why that is, because when the Bishop's Castle did fall into ruin during the 18th century and the early 19th century, it fell into dilapidation. And in its place was built the Royal Infirmary, which, as you know, next to the cathedral still stands. And I love that image at the bottom because old medieval Glasgow looks kind of, it could be anywhere, but it doesn't look very good. There's the horse and cart, and it just looks very much like the old times. And then the cathedral looks like a shrine of the Enlightenment, which is cropping up to save us all. So did I say the infirmary? I might have said cathedral. The infirmary at the back is this prestigious new building which represents a new Glasgow. Luckily for us, William Campbell, a not very well-known poet, wrote this in 1794. He said, "No more the impending law offends our eyes, a nobler, happier dome is seen to rise, whose milder aspect bids contention cease and soothes the mind to harmony and peace. The hostile banner shall approach no more." The hostile banner is the relic of Rome that was perceived at that time to be a reminder for Glaswegians that this was once a Catholic site, and we want to build an infirmary in its place because that's what we do, and that's what we do now as Glaswegians. We soothe the wounds of history and memory with new buildings, and I found this fascinating because if you're going to reconstruct it in 1888, you better be sure that people aren't offended by it anymore. And of course they weren't, right? Of course they just were Victorians who are typically curious of things and poke with umbrellas. How am I doing for time? Who is it? Is there a time? Finish up? Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think that'll do. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much.
If you ever think of the expression AI and history and fake news, you will now know it's really art-inspired Victoriana. And thank you so much. We have time only for a couple of questions. Is anybody wanting to lead us off? Yes, at the back.
What does the Speaker think should be done to all those irrelevant statues in George Square?
I'm a classicist, I say let's take them down.
Well, that's a great question. I've always wanted someone to ask me that, and I've never took the time to prepare an answer. So I'll just give you a live answer to that. What I think we should do is stop worrying about rejigging George Square, right? Because there's always a plan in the Evening Times every 2 years about what it's going to look like, and nothing ever happens. The grass gets changed, doesn't it? That's all that happens. I think
being rejigged next year.
Oh no.
Or this year.
Oh, right, okay.
They'll be closed down and they're taking out all of the unworthy statues and leaving people like James Watt, Robert Burns, and presumably Sir Walter Scott.
Oh, all right, okay. There you go. Are they going to put women in? Maybe, but well, they should. That's exactly the thing. They should be there. But I'll give you a quick example as an answer to that, which is if you go to Stirling and you go to the Wallace Monument, right, that massive phallic creation which says we should all worship the Scots, and you go in there, you'll find that there's a Hall of Heroes, right, and it's all men. But in the middle of that, there's a wee island that is created in the Hall of Heroes, which is like cardboard cutouts of various women in Scottish history who we should also revere. So we still don't know how to do that. That's a great 2 points that are raised because Scottish history is still very male oriented, and in terms of commemoration we're way behind on how to actually do it properly. But your suggestion is a good one. So if they're going to rejig George Square, they could just do the whole lot. Personally, I would just make sure that people know who they are, and then let them decide for themselves if they like them or not, because nobody seems to know. Is there any more questions?
So you talked about things we should know from Georgian theory.
Yeah.
You didn't mention many. Like what kind of things should we know about George in Glasgow?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think that really the main thing I like people to take away about George in Glasgow is that the Fowlis brothers were printers to the university in the middle of the 18th century, and that they initiated an art school within the old campus. And what they did was they sustained the best classical printing house in Scotland during that 1750s period, to the point where they were a household name in Europe and in the main cities of Europe. And they've done that while maintaining an art school in Glasgow, and that their name is so badly reduced now that I think in the old Glasgow School of Art, some of the old buildings, there was a Fowlis, right? And in St Nicholas Garden up at the cathedral, there's a little tiny ironwork thing that says Fowlis on it. You have to really go looking for them. There's also in Ingram Street a little stone that has their names on it as well. But that's never enough. I think the point I've tried to make about how we don't really remember things even if they're put in front of us stands because of that. Their work for the arts and for publishing history was amazing. It was renowned through Britain and Europe, but they are nowhere in Glasgow's memory. So they're my favourite case study from George and Glasgow.
Now, memory may be a challenge, but you will find that this lecture is available on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to watch it again in perfection of memory. May I now invite John to come and do the vote of thanks to our speaker for the evening.
Great, so it's my special privilege to extend our sincere thanks to Craig Lamont for this evening's talk, full of insight, interest, enjoyment and indeed enlightenment, and in the context of, well, Glasgow's 850th anniversary celebrations, and also in the context of a festival named after a man, a bishop, a saint, whose persona really is a construction of cultural memory. He's challenged us, Craig's challenged us to reflect on the layers of history and memory that shape our sense of place, identity and belonging. And he's reminded us of the things we didn't know we know, perhaps, as well as things that we might not have known anyway. And I'd like to thank him for reminding us, for helping us to be part of this process of creating, recreating, and seeing our role in this remembering, this remembering and assembling of cultural memory, and our part in that, and in our own understanding of the city, the place where we live. And as part of that, let me thank you all for being here. It's through such gatherings that the threads of memory and community are drawn together. I should also thank the Archdiocese for hosting us tonight in this warm and comfortable place, which is also so much a vehicle for cultural memory. So, Craig, thank you once again for everything and for your generosity in coming tonight and giving this talk. Thank you.
The rest of the events that we have as part of the festival are all on our St Mungo Facebook page. So St Mungo 2025 Festival Facebook page. We have events on this weekend and for the week after. So please do go onto the Facebook page and have a look and see if anything tickles your fancy. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, and good night.